So looking at the NEPA process, and when we talk about NEPA, we're looking at environmental documents. We're looking at the National Environmental Policy Act of 1969. And this directs how the government should protect and enhance the environment while making decisions. So the three documents that are common in transportation for projects are categorical exclusion, environmental assessment, and environmental impact statement. And these go in order of size. So a categorical exclusion project is a small project. It's likely to not have much of an impact. The government agencies, the transportation agencies, have procedures in place to act in concert with the human and natural environment and can carry out those projects with minimal impact. It may be upgrading a traffic signal system. It can be routine maintenance and operation work as well. On the other end of the spectrum, we have environmental impact statements, and those are huge projects that we know are going to have an impact. So these are new location roadways. These are huge widening projects that may have a substantial impact on the human and natural environment. And ultimately, out of an environmental impact statement, the final document is the record of decision that documents everything that has gone on and the decisions that were made. In between these two is the environmental assessment, an EA. And essentially this is saying we need to study this question a little more closely to determine whether it's going to have an impact or not. And if it's going to have an impact, that needs to lead into a full environmental impact statement. So the document that will come out of that is a finding of no significant impact, a FONSI. And so if it is determined that the project will have no significant impact, the document can end there and no further action is needed. But if it is determined that significant impact will result, then an environmental impact statement will need to be produced that will result in a record of decision. So what I'm going to do in the next several slides is actually show some examples of these documents. They vary in length and complexity as you increase along this spectrum. So the categorical exclusions will be typically very short, usually form based, so some key information that an agency will fill out, up to an environmental impact statement that's hundreds of pages and maybe even thousands of pages long, documenting the full impacts to the human and natural environment, as well as the mitigation effects that will be taken, or the mitigation measures that will be taken to reduce those impacts. So this is looking at a programmatic categorical exclusion, so it fits in that category of categorical exclusions. This is a bridge replacement project. So we can see here, this overview is giving us some idea of what's going on. Some retaining walls are being added. There's a proposed structure in here. It shows its relation to natural and human environmental components. We see residential structures, we see a creek, we see other bodies of water in this location as well. There's public meetings for this, and the project was described to the public, what's going on, what's going to happen with the detour and construction, and allowing the people to come in and learn about the project and maybe express concerns to the Department of Transportation. And looking at the overall cost of this, the total project cost was $2.3 million. The current traffic volume was 2,800 vehicles per day, and then the design year was 3,700 vehicles per day, with 1% twin trailer trucks and 4% dual. So this is an example of kind of the documentation that's involved in a categorical exclusion. Here's the form information that's included in this categorical exclusion. So it's kind of a checklist of things that the agency would need to work through in this additional documentation, and anything that's in the unfavorable response category needs to be explained further. So if there are some impacts, what's going to be done to mitigate this through the categorical exclusion. Next, looking at an environmental assessment. So this is that middle ground where it's a larger project, but it may not fully require an environmental impact statement. And this document actually provided an anticipated NEPA schedule. So what's going to be involved in official briefings and public involvement, when and how are the alternatives going to be developed and analyzed, the final public hearings and revised alternatives and Federal Highway Administration decision. When is that all going to take place or expected to take place? And this was between 2018 and 2020. So here's another example of a FONSI that resulted from an environmental assessment. This is a 126-page document. This is a new interchange in a short section of roadway that's connecting I-85 and ultimately I-40 in Durham, North Carolina, part of NC 147. So it's a few mile segment. This is an important connection in this area. And the key statement here is that the finding of no significant impact and corresponding environmental assessment together from this original 1982 study evaluated 4 build alternatives with respect to social and economic impacts, environmental impacts, and cost of this facility. And so a lot of details that'll be included in here. We'll look at a little bit more of some of this information. Here's some of the information for alternative 3, looking at the locations in the area. So looking at buildings, looking at community centers, libraries, hospitals, looking at historic districts and wetlands, streams, parks, cemeteries, places of worship, local landmarks and parks. So lots of information from a map standpoint of what are going to be potentially impacted by this transportation project. And here's a table showing these various alternatives. And the cells with the black background show the highest impact in each of these 4 alternatives. And so we'll see alternative 3 here looks pretty promising. It doesn't have any of those black boxes. So alternative 3 was balancing a lot of these competing objectives, and it didn't fare the worst in any of these, where you can see as alternative 2 had lots of impacts in replacing existing structures, temporary railroad structures, proposed structures on new locations. So that makes that one fairly difficult, and as a result, more expensive. We see the length of number 1 was the greatest, and the square feet of grade separation was the highest. The actual project length was the longest, though, for alternative 4, and right-of-way and construction limits was the highest there. And the recommended alternative 3, actually had the lowest cost at $137 million. And we can see that the table continues. Alternative 3 continues to perform well relative to the other locations. Now here's an example of an environmental impact statement. So this is the biggest document that resulted in a record of decision. This is the Monroe Expressway that's outside of Charlotte, North Carolina. This is an almost 20-mile long new location roadway from US 74 at I-485 to US 74 near Wingate and Marshville in Union County. So here's the overview of the project, and essentially it's serving as a bypass of the existing US 74 that's going to avoid a lot of traffic signals and increase that reliability and level of service along this corridor. And here are a lot of different alternatives. There were 4 major alternatives, A, B, C, and D, and then there were slight alternatives to each of those that were considered further. And so we can see as we moved up from categorical exclusion to environmental assessment and now an EIS, there's lots of additional detail. So I'm going to click through a couple of these tables that look through each alternative, compare different values, and arrive at a recommended solution. So some of the things we're looking for here are the length, the construction cost, the right-of-way cost, land use considerations, relocations, and neighborhood impacts. So how many residential and business relocations? Community services and facilities. So how many public parks impacted? What about schools and churches, cemeteries? We see this is a huge one for projects, and so all of these alternatives actually avoided impacting cemeteries. Those are very controversial and expensive to relocate. looking at noise impacts, so the number of receptors, so that's homes and businesses that could be impacted by the noise, what mitigation measures would be required, so the length of noise barriers and the number of barriers. Air quality impacts are included. We also look at farmland impacts, so how many farm relocations are required. Utility impacts is a big cost, so looking at transmission line crossings, gas transmission pipelines, railroad crossings, all those are potential impacts. Mitigations are explained here as well. We'll also take a look at visual impacts, hazardous material impacts. Typically, when you're looking at hazardous materials along a roadway corridor, when a project's being done, these usually refer to abandoned, or it can even be also active gas stations and the tanks associated with those. We look at floodplains and floodway impacts. Cultural resources impacts, so looking at the historic resources, archaeological sites. Natural community impacts, so looking at the number of acres that are disturbed, agricultural land, successional forests and upland forest, open waters. All those things are quantified and classified within this document. Ponds and wetlands, perennial streams, total streams, linear feet of stream needing mitigation, and also a documentation of the protected species impacts. And a lot of information goes into this. There's lots of footnotes that are included, lots of mitigation, and all of the alternatives have to have this information collected. So this can be a very long process from the time that a project is conceived to collecting all the necessary information, meeting with the public, gathering their input, and making decisions. So overall, the selected alternative had a length of 19.7 miles, a construction cost of $558 to $616 million. The mitigation for the environmental impacts was approximately $10 million, right-of-way cost between $180 and $200 million, for a total cost of between $750 and $825 million, with a 70% chance the cost is less than $802 million. So very expensive and impactful project here, and that's why this document is prepared. So looking more specifically at the alternative that was selected, it was one of the shortest compared to the others. The shortest one was 19.6. It avoided the wetland impacts at Rocky River Roads. It was the only one of the 8 alternatives that did. It did have a higher cost than most, but lower impacts in several other areas. It was on the low end of residential relocations, but on the high end of the business relocations. And in this documentation, there was actually discussion of this trade-off, being that more businesses would need to be relocated, but it was going to be a further distance from the elementary school. There were no direct school impacts, but there were 3 church property impacts, but not to the actual structures themselves. There were no sports property impacts. It was on the low end of the active agricultural lands, had the least number of hazardous sites. It was in the middle of the upland forest impacts, on the low end of the acres of ponds impacted, in the middle of the number of wetlands, on the lowest end of the perennial streams impacted, somewhat on the middle to low end of the intermittent streams, and no disproportionate impact on minority or low-income populations. There was some information about the indirect and cumulative effect, so 1% greater than incremental effects than the no build, no measurable differences in development or impervious surfaces in the watershed. They expect more medium density growth with less low density growth and only minor water quality effects. And some of the measures they took to minimize the harm. So what are some of the mitigation effects? So in terms of relocations, they tried to ensure that comparable replacement housing was available prior to the construction of the project. For community cohesion, there was a second neighborhood entrance that was added to one of the neighborhoods, and there were noise, visual, and access accommodations done in other locations. And noise barriers were included in the project to help with the impacts from noise that would be generated by the new roadway.